December 2016. A room in St. Louis. Strangers are bidding on a signed LeBron James jersey. Folding chairs. A printed catalog. The final price? $1,500. The man selling it once earned $62 million. His name is Darius Miles. Third overall pick in the 2000 NBA draft, the highest any player had ever been taken straight out of high school. He signed with Jordan Brand at 18. He rode private jets before he ever set foot inside a bank. For 8 seasons, he was one of the most electrifying players in the league. And then it was gone. All of it. On the surface, this looks like another cautionary tale about a broke athlete. But that story is too simple and too convenient. Because Darius Miles didn't fail because he was careless. He failed because no one ever gave him the tools to survive what was coming. This is what really happened. To understand what happened to Darius Miles, you have to understand where Darius Miles came from. Not as a backdrop, not as an excuse, but as the foundation of everything, every decision, every blind spot, every wound that never got the chance to heal. East St. Louis, Illinois. Darius described it himself, plainly and without drama. When you pop out the womb in East St. Louis, it's guns, drugs, and danger, from start to finish. The city had one of the highest murder rates in America. Poverty was not a circumstance, it was the atmosphere. You breathed it. You navigated it every single day. And if you were lucky enough to have something that gave you a way out, you held on to it with everything you had. His father wasn't in the picture. His mother, Ethel, was a school bus driver. She worked. She showed up. She kept the lights on and kept her son moving forward in a neighborhood that had swallowed a lot of kids whole. Darius had one thing: basketball. And from the time he was young, he was exceptional at it. Not good, not promising, exceptional. By his senior year, he was 6 feet 8 inches, 202 pounds, averaging 22 points a game, and ranked as the #1 high school prospect in the entire country. Coaches from every major college program wanted him. He had already signed a national letter of intent to play for the University of Illinois. But here's what matters more than the highlights, more than the rankings. Basketball wasn't just Darius Miles' path to success. It was his pressure valve. Growing up in a place where violence was routine, where, as he later wrote, he had a gun pulled on him as a 6th grader playing basketball in the street. You either find something to absorb that weight, or it absorbs you. For Darius, the court was the only place that pressure lifted. The only place where the chaos of East St. Louis couldn't follow him. The only place he felt free. That's not a minor detail. That's the whole story. And we'll come back to it. In 2000, Darius Miles declared for the NBA draft and tore up his college letter of intent. The Los Angeles Clippers selected him 3rd overall, the highest any prep-to-pro player had ever been drafted in NBA history at that point. He was 18 years old. Within weeks, his entire world transformed. The Clippers flew him to Los Angeles on a private jet. He signed a contract worth roughly $3 million per year. He inked a deal with Jordan Brand. He made cameos in Hollywood films. He was being treated like a celebrity by people twice his age before he'd played a single professional game. And here's the thing nobody talks about when they tell this story. Darius Miles had never been inside a bank. Not once. Not before the draft, not during the draft process, not when the checks started arriving. His entire early understanding of money was a debit card his mother set up for him with a $300 daily ATM withdrawal limit. That was his financial literacy entering the NBA. $300 a day out of a machine. He wasn't dumb. He wasn't naive in the way people condescendingly use that word about young athletes. He simply had never been taught, because nobody in East Street, Los had ever needed to teach him. You don't learn portfolio diversification when your neighborhood is the murder capital of America. You learn how to survive the block. The NBA handed him millions and assumed the rest would work itself out. It wouldn't. But before any of that unraveled, there was a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seasons, when everything looked exactly like it was supposed to. When Darius Miles was exactly who the world expected him to be. That part of the story deserves its moment too. The 2001 Los Angeles Clippers were not a good basketball team. They had been one of the worst franchises in professional sports for the better part of 2 decades. Losing was institutional. The Staples Center, which they shared with the Lakers, might as well have had a velvet rope keeping Clippers fans out. Nobody cared about the Clippers. Nobody watched the Clippers. The Lakers had Shaq and Kobe. The Clippers had empty seats and apologies. And then 5 kids showed up and changed the energy entirely. Darius Miles, Quentin Richardson, Lamar Odom, Corey Maggette, Elton Brand. Most of them barely old enough to rent a car. All of them playing with the kind of loose, fearless, sky's-the-limit basketball that only teenagers and early 20-somethings can pull off. They weren't winning championships. They weren't even making the playoffs. But they were electric. The Clippers went from 15 wins the year before Miles arrived to 31 wins his rookie season, then 39 the year after. For that fan base, that felt like a dynasty. And at the center of it all was Darius Miles. He dunked like it was personal. Like every rim had done something to him specifically. His teammate Shawn Kemp, a veteran who had seen everything, pulled Miles aside early and told him something that stuck. Dunk the ball like you mean it. Every single time. Make people feel it. Miles took that advice and ran with it. Every breakaway became a statement. Every alley-oop became a moment. He and Richardson invented their own celebration, 2 taps to the head, a head knock, and it spread across the entire league. High school kids were doing it in gyms across the country. He was 18 years old. He was first-team all-rookie. He was everywhere. Jordan Brand. Movie cameos. Magazine covers. The phone never stopped ringing. His face was the face of a new generation of NBA basketball. Young, raw, unfiltered, and completely alive. Alonzo Mourning threw a summer party in Miami and invited Miles and Richardson. They were barely adults, jet skiing in South Beach, getting invited into rooms most people never get to enter. And the money was coming in. Steadily. Serious money. But here's what nobody was paying attention to underneath all of it. Darius was spending the way someone spends when they genuinely believe it will never stop. Not recklessly in the tabloid sense. No single moment of catastrophic waste. Just steadily. Freely. The way you spend when you grew up with nothing, and now you have everything, and your brain hasn't caught up to the reality of what everything actually costs to maintain. He was supporting people from back home, picking up tabs, handling situations. That's what you do when you make it out. That's what loyalty looks like where he came from. The problem was that loyalty didn't come with a spreadsheet, and nobody handed him one. This is the part of the story where the financial industry failed Darius Miles quietly and completely. In 2000, the NBA had no mandatory financial education program for rookies. No required orientation about taxes, investments, or the difference between income and wealth. You got your signing bonus, you got an agent negotiating your contract, and after that, you were largely on your own. A kid from East St. Louis who had never been inside a bank was now managing millions of dollars with essentially no infrastructure around him. He didn't know what he didn't know. And the people who did know, advisors, agents, business partners circling the edges, had their own interests to protect. By the end of his second season, Miles had been traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers, then to the Portland Trail Blazers. The money kept growing. The contracts got bigger. The circle around him got larger. And somewhere in the noise of all of it, the foundation that should have been building quietly underneath was not being built at all. The rise felt real. It looked real, but the ground underneath it was already shifting. By 2003, Darius Miles was a Portland trailblazer. On paper, it was an upgrade. Bigger market, more money, a franchise with real playoff ambitions. He signed contracts that pushed his annual salary well past what most people earn in a lifetime. The numbers were staggering from the outside. From the inside, Portland was where the cracks started showing, slowly at first, then all at once. The Trailblazers of that era were already a complicated locker room, a talented, troubled roster that the press had branded the Jail Blazers, a nickname that was reductive and often racially coded, but stuck anyway. Darius Miles arrived into that environment as a young player, still figuring out who he was on and off the court. And the friction wasn't long in coming. In the 2004-05 season, Miles had a confrontation with head coach Maurice Cheeks during a film session that became national news. Reports describe Miles insulting Cheeks, making comments that were deeply disrespectful, and the incident followed him for years. The narrative hardened fast. Darius Miles had an attitude problem. Darius Miles was difficult. Darius Miles didn't care. Here's what the same news cycle didn't spend much time on. That same season, April 19, 2005, Darius Miles scored 47 points against the Denver Nuggets. 47 points. The 8th highest single-game total in Trailblazers franchise history. On a night when he could have quietly gone through the motions, he was extraordinary. The attitude story ran for weeks. The 47-point game was a footnote. When the media has already decided who you are, evidence to the contrary doesn't get equal time. And once that narrative attached itself to Darius Miles, it became almost impossible to shake. Every struggle got filtered through it. Every setback became confirmation of something the press had already concluded. But underneath the headlines, something far more serious was developing. Late in the 2005-06 season, Darius Miles severely injured his right knee. He played through it, returned 5 days later, got through his 40th game of the year, and then the season ended. He expected to recover. He expected to come back. Players get hurt. Players heal. That's the deal. What happened instead was 2 years of silence. He missed the entire 2006-07 season. Microfracture surgery. One of the most grueling procedures in professional sports, with a recovery timeline that could stretch 18 months or longer, and outcomes that were never guaranteed. Then he missed 2007-2008 entirely as well. 2 full seasons. Thousands of hours that should have been spent on a basketball court, spent instead in rehabilitation rooms and doctors' offices, and the interior of his own head. And here's what nobody was asking during those 2 years. When basketball is the pressure valve, when the court is the only place the weight of East Street, Lewis, the only place the accumulated trauma of growing up surrounded by violence actually lifts what happens when you take it away. Darius wrote about it later with a kind of raw clarity that most athletes never manage. He talked about feeling physical pressure on his body, not metaphorical pressure, actual pressure, like something pressing down on him from the outside. And the one release he had always been able to count on, the one place that pressure dissolved, was the basketball court. With his knee destroyed and his future in the league genuinely uncertain, that release was gone. He didn't have a therapist. He didn't have a mental health support system. The NBA of the mid-2000s did not talk about those things. You played through it, or you didn't play. Vulnerability wasn't part of the language. Meanwhile, the money kept moving, and not in the right direction. During those 2 years away from the game, Darius was still paying for a life built around NBA-level income. A circle of people who depended on him. Properties. Obligations. The machinery of wealth doesn't pause because you're in physical therapy. It just keeps running. And without a salary coming in, and without the kind of financial architecture that actually protects long-term wealth, that machinery starts consuming itself. The Trailblazers, watching his $18 million contract sit on their books while Miles hadn't played in 2 years, petitioned the NBA in March 2008 to have an independent doctor determine whether his career was effectively over. The examination confirmed what Portland already suspected. The knee injury was severe enough to be career-ending. He was released in April 2008. He was 26 years old. He still tried. That part matters. He signed with the Boston Celtics, waived before the regular season started. He landed with the Memphis Grizzlies, played in 34 games during the 2008-09 season. He showed up to Charlotte the following year, looking for a roster spot. Didn't get one. The career was over, officially, quietly, without ceremony. And somewhere in the background of all of it, through the surgeries, the trades, the attempts at comebacks, the slow unraveling of his financial picture, his mother Ethel had been fighting something of her own. Liver cancer, colon cancer, bone cancer. 3 separate battles in the body of the one person who had always been his foundation. He carried that weight through every single one of those seasons. And he never told anyone. Let's talk about the money first, because that's what everyone always asks about. By the time Darius Miles played his last professional game in 2009, he had earned just under $62 million in NBA salary alone. That number doesn't include endorsements, doesn't include the Jordan brand deal, doesn't include whatever side income came in during 8 years of being one of the most recognizable players in the league. $62 million. For a kid who grew up with a $300 ATM limit in East St. Louis, that number is almost incomprehensible. So where did it go? The easy answer, the one that gets clicks, the one people want to hear, is that he blew it. Ferraris, jewelry, parties. The standard narrative applied to every broke athlete, regardless of what actually happened. But Darius Miles said it himself, clearly and on the record. It takes a long time to go broke buying Ferraris. What makes you go broke are shady business deals. They'll make the money disappear quick. He wasn't wrong, and the paper trail backs him up. Court documents and bankruptcy filings tell a specific story. A California real estate deal in 2008, gone. Over $100,000, dissolved into a transaction that never delivered what it promised. A property investment on Laclede's Landing in St. Louis, tangled in litigation alongside former NFL running back Marshall Faulk and rapper Nelly. Years of lawsuits, legal fees compounding on top of legal fees, money bleeding out through attorney invoices instead of bad decisions at a dealership. The IRS came looking for $282,041 in unpaid back taxes. Child support arrears of $20,000. 13 properties listed in his bankruptcy filings not as assets, as liabilities. Real estate that was supposed to build wealth and instead built debt. This is the anatomy of how $62 million disappears. Not in one dramatic moment, in 100 quiet ones. A deal here that seemed legitimate, a partnership there from someone who came recommended, taxes that somebody assured him were being handled, obligations that kept growing while the income stopped. And here's the systemic truth underneath all of it. Darius Miles was not uniquely vulnerable to this. He was typically vulnerable. Former NBA Players Union Vice President Adonal Foyle estimated that up to 60% of NBA players file for bankruptcy within 5 years of retiring. 60%. That's not a personal failure at scale. That's a structural one. Young men, many of them from backgrounds with no financial infrastructure, no generational wealth, no family experience with investment or tax planning, are handed millions of dollars, surrounded by people with financial incentives to keep them spending, and then left largely to navigate the aftermath alone. The NBA has improved its financial education programs since then, but in Darius Miles' era, the league's orientation for rookies amounted to a few workshops nobody took seriously. The rest was assumed. He didn't lose $62 million because he was foolish. He lost it because the system that handed him $62 million never gave him the tools to keep it. But the money, as devastating as it was, wasn't what broke him. In 2013, Ethel Miles died. Liver cancer, colon cancer, bone cancer. 3 separate diseases in one body, each one a fight. And she had fought all 3, while her son was bouncing between cities, trying to save a basketball career that was already over. She had raised him alone in one of the most dangerous cities in America. She had driven a school bus so the lights stayed on. She had been the one constant, the one person in his life who knew exactly where he came from and loved him completely because of it, not in spite of it. When she died, Darius Miles did not leave her house for an entire year. Not a figure of speech, literally. He stayed inside. He slept during the day. At night he drank wine and smoked weed, trying to quiet a mind that wouldn't stop. The paranoia set in deep, irrational, and completely real to him. He got his concealed carry permit and started carrying a gun everywhere he went. Not for protection in any specific sense, just because the weight of it felt like the only control he had left. He had worked his entire life to escape East St. Louis, and now he was back, trapped in his mother's house, trapped inside his own head. The city that had shaped him had reclaimed him, and there was no basketball court left to run to. I was stuck in my mama's house in East St. Louis for like 3 years, he wrote later. I worked my whole life to get out of there, and I was back, just trapped. The depression was severe. The PTSD from a childhood spent running from gunshots, from years of accumulated trauma that basketball had helped him suppress rather than process, finally had nowhere to hide. He had never cried. Not once through any of it. Not when the knee gave out. Not when the career ended. Not when the money started disappearing. He had learned, growing up where he grew up, that you didn't show that. That strength meant silence. That feeling things was a luxury you couldn't afford. And now all of it was sitting on his chest at once. The people who owed him money, and there were several, became an obsession. He had lent freely, supported generously, taken care of people the way you take care of people when you make it out of a place like East St. Louis, and loyalty means something real. And now, broke and grieving and increasingly unmoored, he started thinking about collecting, about what he was owed, about consequences. I just got to a point where I saw red, for real, he wrote. I felt like I was going to hurt somebody, or I was going to wind up in jail. He meant it. That wasn't rhetoric or dramatic writing. That was a man on the edge of something he couldn't come back from, describing exactly where he was standing. 7 years, 8 years, no interviews, no appearances, no contact with the outside world he'd once occupied. He disappeared so completely that people genuinely forgot about him or remembered him only as a punchline. Whatever happened to Darius Miles? Heard he blew all his money. Heard he lost it. Shame, really. And then the conversation moved on. Meanwhile, Darius was still in his mother's house, still awake at 3 a.m., still carrying a gun, still seeing red. September 18th, 2016. Darius Miles filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in federal court. The most complete form of bankruptcy available under American law. A full accounting, a full liquidation, a full stop. The filing listed $460,385 in assets against $1,570,000 in debt. In the bank, $49,000. A college fund for his son, nearly double that. And then the list of what remained to be sold. The bankruptcy auction was scheduled for December 14, 2016. The catalog read like an archaeological dig through someone's better years. An autographed baseball bat, a Mark McGuire signature, thousands of DVDs and video games still in their cases, firearms, including a Ruger AR-556 rifle, and a LeBron James jersey, signed, authenticated. Final sale price, $1,500. That's where this story started, a room in St. Louis. Folding chairs, strangers placing bids. Now you know what it cost to get there. $62 million earned. 13 properties that became debt. A mother gone. 8 years of silence and paranoia, and a loaded gun that never got used. A bankruptcy filing in a federal courthouse. And a jersey on an auction table going for $1,500. That is the full weight of what the headline, $62 million gone, actually means. It's not a story about waste. It's a story about a system that takes kids from nothing, gives them everything, strips away the one thing holding them together, and then watches from a comfortable distance while they try to figure out how to survive it. Darius Miles was 34 years old when he filed that paperwork. He had his whole life left, and he was about to make the hardest decision of it. One night, after years of silence, Darius Miles picked up the phone and called Quentin Richardson. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No breaking point, no rock-bottom revelation, no movie-ready epiphany. Just a man alone in his mother's house in East St. Louis, still carrying a gun, still sleeping through the days, still seeing red when he thought about the money he was owed, and finally, quietly, having enough of it. He called Q. Quentin Richardson had been his teammate, his running mate, the other half of the head knock celebration that had defined the young Clippers era. They had been inseparable from the moment they arrived in Los Angeles. Together, two teenagers from rough backgrounds, suddenly famous, figuring out the world at the same speed. Richardson had been living in Florida for years. He had built something stable, and he had never stopped reaching out to Darius, even when Darius stopped answering. Q was relentless, Miles said later. Phone calls, text messages, showing up when he could. Not pushing, not lecturing, just refusing to let the friendship die of neglect. That kind of loyalty is rarer than it sounds. Most people, when someone goes dark for months and then years, eventually stop knocking. Richardson kept knocking. That night on the phone, something shifted. Darius didn't explain it in complicated terms. He just knew he had to move, had to do something, had to get out of that house, out of that city, out of the loop his mind had been running in for years. He packed a U-Haul, and he drove 14 hours straight through the night to Florida. No plan beyond the drive itself. No grand vision for what came next. Just 14 hours on the highway, alone with his thoughts, moving away from everything that had been holding him underwater. By the time he pulled up near Richardson's house as the sun was coming up, something had already changed. Not fixed, not healed, but shifted enough to breathe. He moved in down the street from Q. They started talking. Really talking the way two people talk when they've known each other long enough to skip the performance and get to the truth. Richardson had been quietly working on something. He wanted Darius to write his story. Not a sanitized version, not a redemption narrative wrapped in a bow. The real one. The depression, the gun, the paranoia, the years of silence. The things that men from where they came from were not supposed to say out loud. You gotta tell your truth, Richardson kept telling him. People need to hear this. In October 2018, Darius Miles published an essay in the Players Tribune titled, "What the Hell Happened to Darius Miles?" Richardson helped edit every word of it. 6,500 words. Unfiltered. Honest in a way that most public figures, athlete or otherwise, never allow themselves to be. He wrote about the gun, about seeing red, about not leaving his mother's house, about PTSD he'd never had a name for before, about depression he'd spent his whole life believing he wasn't allowed to feel. I know dudes like me aren't supposed to talk about depression, he wrote. But I'll talk about it. If a real one like me can struggle with it, then anybody can struggle with it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not because it was a celebrity confessing weakness, but because it was specific and true. Athletes across the league reached out. People who had never met him reached out. The essay didn't position him as a victim or a cautionary tale. It positioned him as someone who had been through something real and was still standing. The following year, he and Richardson launched the Knuckleheads podcast. Two former players talking openly about the game, the business, the mental and financial realities that league had never publicly discussed. It found an audience quickly. Not because it was polished, because it was honest. For the first time in nearly a decade, Darius Miles had something to build again. But recovery, as anyone who has been through real darkness knows, is not a straight line. In October 2021, federal prosecutors charged Darius Miles and 18 other former NBA players with conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. The allegation? Submitting false claims to the NBA's health and welfare benefit plan for medical and dental procedures that were never actually performed. The total amount involved across all defendants, approximately $5 million. Miles pleaded guilty in June 2023. In November 2023, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation. It would be convenient to leave that out. To end the story at the podcast and the essay and the drive to Florida and call it a comeback. But that wouldn't be honest. And Darius Miles, of all people, has earned honesty in how his story gets told. What is true is this: he is still here. He still hosts the podcast. He is still a father, and by his own account, it was his children more than anything else that pulled him back from the edge during the worst of it. "My kids made me get back out here," he said. "I've got to leave them something." He is still figuring it out, the same as the rest of us. That's not a Hollywood ending, but it might be the most human one available. So what really happened to Darius Miles? People ask about the $62 million. They want the itemized list. The bad deals, the tax debt, the auction catalog, the jersey that sold for $1,500. They want the number broken down into digestible mistakes so they can nod along and feel like they understand it, so they can tell themselves they'd have done it differently. But that question, where did the money go, is the wrong question. The right question is this: what happens when you take a teenager out of one of the most traumatic environments in America, hand him a fortune, surround him with people who profit from his spending, give him no financial education, no mental health support, no exit plan for the day the career ends, and then act surprised when it falls apart? Darius Miles didn't fail because he was reckless. He failed because the system that built him up had no interest in what happened to him after. Think about the timeline clearly. At 18, he entered a league with no mandatory financial literacy program for rookies. At 24, he suffered a career-threatening knee injury with no psychological support structure in place for what losing basketball would mean to a man who used it to survive. At 27, his career was over. At 31, his mother died. At 34, he filed for bankruptcy. And through almost all of it, through the grief, the paranoia, the years alone in that house with a gun, nobody in any official capacity ever asked how he was doing. They asked about his knee. They asked about his contract. They asked about the confrontation with Maurice Cheeks. Nobody asked about his mama. That line, his own line, from his own essay, is the most important thing Darius Miles ever said publicly. Because it exposes the exact gap between how we talk about athletes and who athletes actually are. We consume their bodies and their highlights and their failures. We turn their worst moments into content. And we almost never stop to ask what was happening underneath. Darius Miles is in his early 40s now. He lives in Florida, down the street from his best friend. He hosts a podcast. He is a father trying to leave something behind for his kids. He is a man who drove 14 hours through the night to save his own life and then wrote honestly about why he'd needed saving in the first place. He is not a cautionary tale. He is not a punchline. He is a person who came from nothing, carried more than anyone knew, and is still standing. The $62 million is gone. But here's what that number never captured. Not on draft night, not at the peak, not in the bankruptcy filing. What it cost to be Darius Miles. And what it took to still be here.